My fragile sister stole my best friend by faking illnesses and playing damsel in distress, and he dumped me for her pity party. 6 months later, he is begging to see me. My childhood best friend Theo and I were inseparable. We'd grown up next door to each other, building blanket forts in his backyard, sneaking cookies from his grandmother's kitchen, planning our futures like kids do. When we're 30, we'll live in houses next to each other, he'd say, with a gate between the yards, so we never have to walk around. Natalie was always there, watching from her bedroom window, too fragile for our adventures. I was valedictorian, got into Columbia on full scholarship, and landed a job at a tech startup that went public. Theo went to state school, studied business, and took over his family's restaurant chain. We stayed close through it all. You're killing it, he'd say when I got promoted to senior developer at 26. Natalie worked part-time at a boutique and claimed anything more triggered her anxiety. Must be nice being naturally gifted, she'd say at family dinners. Some of us have to struggle. The shift started when I bought my condo. Natalie suddenly developed opinions about Theo. He treats you like a buddy, not a woman, she said. Have you noticed how gentle he is with me? How he actually sees me? I hadn't noticed because it wasn't true, but Natalie had a way of planting seeds. She started showing up when we hung out, claiming she felt faint and needed air. Theo, raised to be a gentleman, would offer her water, his jacket, his concern. Your sister seems unwell, he'd say. Maybe we should include her more. Including her more meant our conversations became three-way negotiations where Natalie would steer everything toward her struggles. I tried to read that book you recommended, she'd tell Theo, but my dyslexia made it impossible. Unlike some people, reading doesn't come naturally to me. She didn't have dyslexia. She had laziness. But Theo started seeing me through her filter. You know, you can be pretty intense, he said one night after Natalie spent an hour describing how my success made her feel inadequate. Maybe dial it back around her? Dial what back? Existing? Don't be like that. She's fragile. The real shift came when Theo's grandfather got sick. Pancreatic cancer, 3 months to live. The old man called me to his bedside while Theo was at work. I have one wish, he said, holding my hand with his paper-thin fingers. You marry my Theodore. You're the only one strong enough to handle him. We're just friends, Grandpa Lou. Friends, he scoffed. I've watched you two for 20 years. He loves you. He's just too stupid to see it. Promise me you'll try. I promised because you don't deny dying wishes. When Grandpa Lou told Theo about his wish, Natalie was conveniently there, having brought him soup for his poor digestion. How romantic, she cooed later. Too bad Theo sees you as a sister. He doesn't see me as a sister. Then why did he tell me he could never marry you? That it would be like marrying family? Theo became distant, awkward. The engagement conversation was brutal. I can't marry you, Theo said. It wouldn't be fair to either of us. Your grandfather's dying wish isn't fair? He doesn't understand. I'm in love with Natalie. You're not in love with her. You pity her. That's cruel. Just because someone isn't as successful as you doesn't make them pitiful. No, but lying about medical conditions for attention does. She's not lying. You're just jealous that for once someone chooses her over you. That stung more than I expected. I left that night. Not dramatically, just packed up my life and took a job offer in Seattle. Didn't say goodbye, didn't explain, just disappeared. 6 months later, Theo called at 2 a.m. I could tell he was drunk before he spoke. Heard the bar noise in the background, glasses clinking. I fucked up, he slurred. I fucked up so bad. Theo, go home. Can't go home. Everything reminds me of you. That stupid coffee shop on 5th? Can't walk past it. Remember when you spilled that entire latte on your laptop? You laughed so hard you cried. His voice cracked. I haven't heard you laugh in 8 months. You're drunk. I'm empty. There's a difference. You left and took everything with you. 20 years of inside jokes, gone. 20 years of knowing someone would pick up when I called. He was crying now. Ugly sobs that made my chest tight. Do you know what it's like to lose your person? Your actual person? My grandfather was right. Said I had this perfect thing right in front of me and I was too stupid to see it. You know what he said before he died? He said, don't lose her, Theo. Everything else is noise, but don't lose her. And what did I do? I chose someone else. I looked at 20 years of you showing up for me, staying up all night when my dad had his heart attack, teaching me to code so we could talk about your work, being my absolute best friend, and I chose someone else. Come back, please. We can fix this. There's no we. You chose her. I chose wrong. Yeah, you did. I hung up. Natalie texted me that night, crying. I didn't open Natalie's text. I sat on my apartment floor after hanging up on Theo, my phone still warm in my hand, and forced myself to breathe slowly through the tightness in my chest. His words echoed in my head, but I refused to let myself spiral into what-ifs, or maybe I should have scenarios. I got up and walked to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and pulled out a chamomile tea bag I knew I wouldn't actually drink. The water boiled and I poured it, watching the steam rise while my hands steadied. I carried the mug to the window and stared at the Seattle skyline, all those lit windows and buildings full of people living their own complicated lives. My heartbeat returned to normal after maybe 20 minutes of just standing there, breathing, existing. Sleep didn't come, so I spent the night scrolling through our text history from before I left, reading conversations where Theo asked my advice about Natalie's latest crisis. Every message showed me playing therapist to his confusion, never once saying what I actually felt. I'd written things like, maybe give her some space to figure it out, and she needs to find her own solutions, when what I meant was, stop letting her manipulate you. At 4 a.m., I closed the thread without deleting it and put my phone across the room, face down on my dresser. Morning arrived with gray Seattle rain, and I went through my usual routine like a robot. Shower, coffee, the same oatmeal I ate every day with blueberries and a drizzle of honey. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked tired, but I'd gotten good at functioning on no sleep. I chose my favorite sweater, the green one that had nothing to do with anyone back home, pulled on jeans and headed out the door. At the office, my manager Gabrielle found me staring at my screen without typing and dropped into the chair beside me with her usual directness. She told me the team had a sprint deadline in 3 days and asked if I was good to lead the final push, or if she needed to reassign. I told her I was good, grateful for something concrete to focus on. She nodded once and rolled back to her own desk without making it weird. That evening in my apartment elevator, my neighbor Serena asked how I was doing with the same casual friendliness she always had. I gave her my standard fine, busy with work response, but she smiled and mentioned she was making too much pasta if I wanted to come by. I declined politely, but something about the offer made me feel slightly less alone in this city where I'd built a whole new life. Late that night, I opened my photo albums and looked at pictures from our childhood. Blanket forts in his backyard, high school graduation with our caps thrown in the air, the day I got into Columbia and Theo lifted me off the ground in a hug. I scrolled to 3 photos of Theo and me at his grandfather's restaurant, the old man's arm around both our shoulders. I deleted them, watched them disappear, then immediately went to recently deleted and restored them. I closed the app feeling pathetic but also somehow lighter, like I'd tested something and survived it. On Wednesday morning, I finally did something I'd been avoiding for months, and booked a therapy appointment with a counselor named Rena, who had good reviews on Psychology Today. The earliest slot was next week, which felt both too soon and not soon enough. I added it to my calendar and felt something shift in my chest, a small loosening. At our morning stand-up meeting, I overcompensated for my distraction by presenting an overly detailed analysis of my code module, breaking down every function and edge case. Gabrielle caught my eye afterward and just nodded, understanding without making me explain. The rest of the team accepted my thoroughness without question because I'd always been this way, the person who went 3 layers deeper than necessary. That Friday evening, Theo sent an email instead of calling. The subject line just said, "I'm sorry." And when I opened it, the message was sober, coherent, taking full responsibility without making excuses or asking for anything. He wrote that he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again, and that he was sorry for calling drunk, sorry for dumping all that on me. The email sat in my inbox all weekend while I decided whether to respond. I drafted 4 different replies ranging from angry to cordial, but I didn't send any of them. Each version felt either too much or not enough, too open or too cold. Finally, I saved them all in a drafts folder labeled Theo and closed my laptop, leaving the whole thing unresolved. Monday morning, I drove across town to a building near the University District, found the right suite number, and walked into Rena's office at exactly 10 a.m. The space smelled like lavender from a diffuser on her desk, and she had one of those white noise machines running in the corner that made the room feel separate from the world outside. I sat in the chair across from her and spent the next 50 minutes walking through everything. Theo's drunk call, Natalie's manipulation, Grandpa Lou's dying wish, my move to Seattle, the drafts folder full of emails I couldn't send. Rena took notes on a yellow legal pad without interrupting, just nodding occasionally to show she was tracking. When I finished, she set down her pen and asked one question. "When did you first learn that being the strong one meant not needing anything?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out because I'd never thought about it that way before, never connected those two things as if they were a rule I'd been following my whole life. She let the silence sit there between us while I tried to form words that wouldn't come. Finally, she said we'd explore that more next week, and I left feeling like I'd been gently taken apart and not quite put back together yet. Tuesday evening, I was heating up leftover Thai food when someone knocked on my door. Serena stood there holding a bright yellow flyer for building trivia night happening Thursday in the common room. She said her usual team needed a 4th person, and I seemed like I'd be good at random facts. Would I want to join them? I said yes before my brain could manufacture reasons to say no, before I could retreat into work, or claim I was too busy, or make up some excuse about needing to be somewhere else. She grinned and said great. They met at 7 and to bring snacks if I wanted, but it wasn't required. After she left, I stuck the flyer on my fridge with a magnet and felt something loosen in my chest. Like maybe I could be a person who did normal neighbor things and didn't just exist in my apartment like a ghost. Wednesday at work, I sent a message to a junior developer named Chris about a pull request that had some basic errors in it. I kept the feedback technical, but my tone came across sharper than I meant, more irritated than instructive, like I was annoyed he'd made such simple mistakes. Gabrielle pulled me aside an hour later in one of the small conference rooms. She told me gently that my intensity was an asset to the team, that I pushed everyone to be better, but my tone lately had been sharp in a way that wasn't like me. I felt defensive for about 10 seconds, ready to explain that I was just trying to maintain code quality, but then I actually heard what she was saying. She was right. I'd been taking my own stress and frustration and letting it bleed into how I communicated with people who didn't deserve that. I told her I'd work on it, and she nodded once, squeezed my shoulder, and we went back to our desks without making it into a bigger thing than it needed to be. Late Thursday night, I was already in my pajamas, brushing my teeth before bed, when my phone lit up on the bathroom counter. A text from Natalie appeared on the lock screen. "I really need to talk to you about something important." I stared at those words while toothpaste foam dried in my mouth, feeling my stomach twist because I knew this pattern. So well I could recite it like a script. Vague crisis without details, emotional fishing expedition, making it my responsibility to ask what's wrong and offer to help and drop everything to manage whatever she'd decided was an emergency this time. I rinsed my mouth and picked up the phone, read the message 3 more times, and felt the old familiar pull to respond, to be the good sister who shows up, to prove I wasn't cold or selfish or whatever she'd say I was if I didn't engage. I set the phone face down on my nightstand and got into bed, turned off the light, and lay there in the dark staring at the ceiling for 5 full minutes before I could convince my body to relax. I didn't respond to Natalie's text, and after sleeping on it through a restless night where I woke up 3 times, I blocked her number entirely the next morning. I sat at my kitchen table with my journal, the one Rena had suggested I start keeping, and wrote down the boundary I was setting and exactly why I was setting it. I'm blocking Natalie because her pattern is to create vague crises that pull me into emotional labor I can't afford right now. I need space to work on myself without being responsible for managing her feelings. My hands shook a little as I wrote, partly from guilt, and partly from something that felt like power, like I was taking back control over who got access to me and when. I read the words 3 times to make them feel real, to cement them in my brain as an actual decision I was allowed to make. Then I closed the journal and made breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, and felt more grounded than guilty for the first time in weeks. The following Monday, my phone rang while I was in a meeting, so I let it go to voicemail and checked it during my lunch break. Mike Joe, one of Theo's managers at the restaurant, had left a message saying he was worried about Theo, who'd been missing shifts, and seemed really out of it when he did show up. I'd met Mike maybe 5 times over the years at the restaurant events and family gatherings. Nice guy who took his job seriously and genuinely cared about the people who worked for him. I called him back and appreciated his concern, but told him as gently as I could that I wasn't the person to help with this anymore. He sounded surprised when I said I couldn't be Theo's support system, like he'd just assumed I would drop everything to fix whatever was happening, because that's what I'd always done before. I explained that Theo had family and other friends and resources, that there were people in his life who could help him, and that I needed to take care of myself right now. Mike was quiet for a second, and then said he understood, apologized for putting me in an awkward position, hoped I was doing okay. After we hung up, I felt guilty, but also strangely proud of myself, like I'd just passed some test I didn't know I was taking. That same week, a major bug appeared in production during a routine deployment, something that crashed the payment processing module for about 40 minutes before we caught it. The issue traced back to code in my module from 2 months ago, a conditional statement I'd written that didn't account for a specific edge case. I spent 14 hours straight fixing it, barely eating except for a protein bar someone left on my desk, running on coffee and adrenaline and the sharp focus that comes from knowing you've broken something important. When it was finally resolved at 11 p.m., when the fix was deployed and tested and confirmed working, I sat back in my chair and realized I'd been using work crises to avoid thinking about anything else. The bug had been a relief in a twisted way, a concrete problem with a technical solution that didn't require me to examine my feelings or make hard choices about relationships. Gabrielle found me still at my desk at midnight, still staring at my monitor even though the work was done. She firmly told me to go home, not as a suggestion, but as a directive from my manager. The next morning, she sat me down in her office before stand-up, and we talked about my perfectionism trap, how I used being excellent at work to feel in control when everything else in my life was messy and uncertain. She said she recognized it because she'd done the same thing earlier in her career, worked herself into burnout trying to feel stable. I admitted she was right and promised to work on balance, to set boundaries around my work hours, to stop using technical problems as emotional avoidance. She made me put it in writing, literally had me draft an email to myself with specific commitments about leaving by 7 p.m. and not checking Slack after dinner. I sent it and she nodded, satisfied. In my next therapy session, Rena asked about my family dynamics growing up, how roles got assigned and who was expected to be what. I realized as I talked through it that I'd always been cast as the strong one while Natalie was the fragile one, that our parents had treated those labels like permanent assignments we couldn't change. I was the one who got good grades without help, who didn't cry when things went wrong, who could be counted on to handle adult responsibilities early. Natalie was the one who needed accommodations and special treatment and constant reassurance that she was okay. We explored how that conditioning had taught me my needs didn't matter as much as keeping everyone else stable, that asking for help meant I was failing at my assigned role. The session left me feeling raw, like I'd peeled back a layer of skin I didn't know was there, but also like something important had just clicked into place, a pattern I could finally see clearly enough to maybe start changing. That Thursday evening, Serena knocked on my door with the trivia flyer in hand, and I found myself walking down to the common room with her. She introduced me to her friends, 2 women named Jess and Amber who worked in marketing and seemed genuinely nice without trying too hard. We grabbed a table near the back and ordered drinks, and when the questions started, I surprised myself by actually knowing answers about obscure history and random science facts. Serena was good at pop culture, Jess handled sports, and Amber knew everything about food and geography. We worked together naturally, passing the answer sheet around, debating quietly when we disagreed. By the final round, we were tied for first place with another team, and when they announced the last question about a specific battle in World War II, I knew the answer immediately. We came in second place, which felt better than winning somehow, less pressure and more fun. Afterward, we stayed for drinks and the conversation flowed easily, nothing heavy or forced. Serena mentioned casually while we were talking about bad decisions that she'd had a messy breakup 2 years ago, where her ex chose someone else. She didn't make it about me or try to draw comparisons, just shared her own story about how she'd moved to Seattle to start over and how it took her a full year to feel normal again. I felt something loosen in my chest, this recognition that other people survived this specific kind of hurt and built actual lives afterward. 2 weeks later, another email from Theo appeared in my inbox, longer than the first one and more detailed. He listed specific things he did wrong, like how he let Natalie manipulate situations without calling it out, how he made me feel intense for just existing, how he chose someone else's manufactured crisis over 20 years of real friendship. He wrote about realizing he confused pity with love, about how he got addicted to feeling needed instead of recognizing what he actually wanted. The email made clear he wasn't asking me to forgive him or come back, that he just wanted me to know he finally saw all of it now. I saved the email and brought it to my next session with Rena. She read through it carefully while I sat across from her, picking at my cuticles and feeling anxious. We talked about what accountability actually looks like, versus manipulation dressed up as apology, and she pointed out how he took responsibility without making demands or putting pressure on me. I drafted a reply that took me 40 minutes to get right, thanking him for the accountability and saying I appreciated that he wasn't making demands. I told him I needed continued distance, but I was glad he was working on himself. My finger hovered over the send button for a full minute before I finally pressed it and my heart raced, but I didn't feel regret. That weekend, Mike texted me out of nowhere saying Theo and Natalie were on a break and had been for a few weeks now. I stared at my phone feeling this weird mix of vindication and unease, like maybe I should feel more satisfied, but mostly I just felt tired. I texted back thanking him for the update and didn't ask for details because I genuinely didn't want to know more. In early month 2, my family group chat exploded with messages about establishing a scholarship fund in Grandpa's name at the local community college. My mom posted old photos of him. My cousins shared memories about his cooking. Everyone started planning a small memorial event for the following month. My chest physically ached reading through it all because I loved that man so much, and now I was completely excluded from honoring him properly. I brought the whole scholarship situation to therapy, and Rena asked me a question that shifted everything. She wanted to know what honoring Grandpa looked like without erasing myself, or returning to situations that would hurt me. We talked about how I could respect his memory while still keeping the boundaries I needed, how those two things didn't have to cancel each other out. The question made me realize I'd been thinking in all or nothing terms when there were actually other options. I went home and made an anonymous donation to the scholarship fund through the college website, enough money to fully fund one student for an entire year. Then I opened the family group chat and typed out a polite RSVP declining the memorial event, saying I had work commitments that weekend that I couldn't move. The lie made me feel guilty, but the relief was stronger, knowing I wasn't forcing myself into a painful situation just to prove something. That weekend, Serena invited me on a local hike up Rattlesnake Ledge, and I agreed even though I hadn't exercised in weeks and wasn't sure I could handle it. We drove out early Saturday morning and started up the trail, which was steeper than I expected. My legs burned after the first 20 minutes and I had to stop twice to catch my breath, but Serena just waited patiently without making me feel weak about it. The physical work of climbing cleared my head in a way sitting in my apartment never did, forcing me to focus on my breathing and my steps instead of spiraling thoughts. At the top, we sat on the rocks looking out over the lake and I felt actually present in my body for the first time in months. At work on Monday, Gabrielle called me into her office and told me she was assigning me as technical lead for a new feature they were building. It was a small project, just me and 2 junior developers, but it was my first official leadership role. I felt doubt creep in immediately, that familiar voice saying I wasn't ready or I'd mess it up somehow, but I accepted anyway and started planning out the work. Having something new to build instead of just maintaining existing code felt like moving forward instead of treading water. In mid-month 2, I checked my mailbox and found a handwritten letter from Theo, forwarded from my old address in a second envelope. My hands actually shook holding it, and I carried it upstairs without opening it, setting it on my kitchen counter where I could see it. 2 days passed with the envelope just sitting there, and finally on the 3rd morning I opened it carefully. 3 pages of neat handwriting filled with careful honesty about his patterns and mistakes, about how he'd been going to therapy weekly, and working on understanding why he made the choices he did. The letter sat on my counter for 3 more days before my next therapy appointment, and I brought it with me in my bag, the envelope now creased from handling. Rena's office smelled like lavender, and I sat in my usual chair, pulling out the pages with hands that felt steadier than I expected. I read parts of it aloud, stumbling over the sections where Theo wrote about recognizing his patterns, how he'd confused being needed with being loved, how he saw now what Natalie had done, but also what he'd allowed. Rena listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked how it felt to be was chosen now, when it was already too late. The question cracked something open in my chest and I started crying, not the hopeful kind of tears, but the grieving kind, mourning what could have been if he'd seen me when I was still there. We talked about timing and how his realization didn't erase the fact that he couldn't see me until I was gone, how that truth mattered even if he was sorry now. I left the session with swollen eyes and a box of tissues in my purse, feeling emptied out but somehow lighter. 2 days later, Mike texted me an update I hadn't asked for, saying Theo had stopped working the late-night shifts at the restaurant and was seeing a counselor every week. I sat on my couch reading the message 3 times, feeling cautiously hopeful that maybe he was actually doing the work this time instead of just saying the right words. I typed back a brief thanks and then added that his growth wasn't about me, that whatever healing he was doing needed to be for himself. Mike sent back a thumbs up and I put my phone down, reminding myself that Theo's journey was separate from mine now, that I couldn't let his progress become something I monitored or measured my own recovery against. The next morning, my mom sent me a screenshot of a post Natalie had made on social media, something vague about being betrayed by the people who should love you most, with a string of broken heart emojis. I felt irritation spike for about 5 minutes, imagining what story she was spinning to make herself the victim again, but then I realized I genuinely didn't care what narrative she was creating. I opened the family group chat and muted it for a week, not dramatically or with explanation, just clicking the button and watching the notifications disappear. The relief was immediate, and I went back to my coffee without the weight of their drama sitting in my chest. One quiet evening after work, I opened my photo albums again, this time with actual intention instead of just painful scrolling. I deleted the pictures that hurt to look at, the ones where Theo and I were too close or too happy, where I could see on my own face how much I cared while he looked at me like a buddy. I kept the ones that represented good memories I didn't want to lose, the blanket fort photos from childhood, our high school graduation, the time we went camping and got completely lost. It wasn't about erasing Theo from my history, but about choosing what I carried forward, curating my past instead of letting it haunt me. I moved through the albums methodically, making decisions without second guessing, and when I was done, I had half as many photos, but they felt cleaner somehow. At the start of month 3, my phone lit up with a message from Theo that made my stomach drop before I even read it. He was asking if he could meet me in person for coffee, just once, to talk about everything that had happened. He emphasized it would be on my terms, in a public place, that I could absolutely say no, and he'd respect that. I stared at the message for an hour, reading it over and over, feeling my chest get tight with the weight of the decision. Finally, I typed back that I needed time to think about it. Not yes, but not no either. Buying myself space to figure out what I actually wanted. His response came back within minutes saying he understood, and to take all the time I needed, and I put my phone face down on the table so I wouldn't keep checking it. My next therapy session with Rena turned into practicing what boundaries would look like if I decided to meet him. We scripted out things I wanted to say, writing them down on paper so I could see them, and what topics I absolutely wasn't willing to discuss no matter what he asked. She reminded me I could leave at any time, that meeting him didn't mean I owed him forgiveness or friendship or anything beyond basic courtesy. We role-played different scenarios, with Rena asking questions like Theo might and me practicing responses that held firm without being cruel. By the end of the hour, I felt more prepared, like I had tools instead of just anxiety, and I left with the script folded in my wallet. That evening, I texted Theo back and agreed to meet at a busy coffee shop near Pike Place Market on Saturday afternoon, public and crowded like he'd promised. Saturday arrived gray and drizzly, typical Seattle weather, and I got to the coffee shop 15 minutes early to claim a table near the window. Theo walked in exactly on time, looking thinner than I remembered, and tired in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep. We sat across from each other with our drinks between us like a barrier, and for the first minute, neither of us spoke. Then he apologized again, this time without the desperate edge from his drunk call, just steady and clear about what he'd done wrong. He didn't deflect or make excuses, didn't blame Natalie entirely or claim he'd been confused, just took responsibility for choosing wrong and hurting me. I actually believed him this time, could see in his face that he meant it. Theo told me he'd realized he confused pity with love when it came to Natalie, that he got caught up in feeling needed instead of recognizing what he actually wanted from a relationship. He admitted he was complicit in the way Natalie had worked to drive a wedge between us, that he should have seen through her manipulations, but he'd been too focused on being the good guy who helped the struggling person. Hearing him name it all so clearly, without me having to explain or convince him, validated everything I'd felt for months. He talked about his counseling sessions and what he was learning about his patterns, how he'd been conflict avoidant his whole life, and how that made him vulnerable to people who played victim. I listened without interrupting, watching his face to see if he was performing, or if this was real, and I decided it was real even if it was also too late. When he finished, I took a breath and told him clearly that I wouldn't go back to being his emotional support person or his best friend who dropped everything to fix his problems. I explained that I needed to build a life that didn't center around being available for other people's crises, that I was learning what healthy boundaries looked like and I couldn't go backward. He nodded and said he understood, that he wasn't asking me to come back or be what we were before, that he just wanted me to know he saw it all now. The conversation lasted maybe 40 minutes, and we finished our coffee without any promises about staying in touch or trying again someday. There was mutual respect in how we talked to each other, but no resolution, no plan for what came next, and that felt appropriate somehow. We said goodbye outside the coffee shop with a brief hug that felt more like closure than connection, and I walked back to my apartment feeling sad, but also strangely peaceful, like I'd done something hard and survived it intact. The following week at work, my code pushed to production on Tuesday morning, and I watched the deployment dashboard with my small team clustered around my monitor. The feature went live without errors, and by Wednesday afternoon, the user feedback started rolling in, mostly positive comments about the improved interface speed. Thursday evening, Gabrielle pulled our team together for drinks at the bar down the street from the office, the one with the sticky floors and cheap beer. She raised her glass and said something about my leadership during the project, how I'd kept everyone focused without being pushy, and the team clapped. I felt this warmth in my chest that wasn't about proving anything to anyone, just genuine pride in work I'd done well. No deflecting, no downplaying, just accepting that I'd earned this moment. A few weeks into month 4, my phone rang while I was making dinner and Mom's name lit up the screen. She asked if I could come home for a weekend to help sort through boxes in their storage unit, stuff from when they downsized last year that were included things from my childhood bedroom. My first reaction was irritation, this familiar feeling of being pulled back into obligations I'd carefully extracted myself from. But I took a breath and said yes. I could do Saturday and Sunday, then immediately booked a hotel room near their house before she could suggest I stay with them. I bought a plane ticket for early Saturday morning and a return flight Sunday at 4, giving myself exactly 36 hours with built-in escape routes. Thursday night, I mentioned the trip to Serena when we ran into each other getting mail, and she offered to water my plants while I was gone. She made this joke about being my Seattle safety contact if I needed an emergency extraction, and I laughed because she got it without me having to explain why a simple family visit required tactical planning. Saturday afternoon, I drove my rental car to the grocery store to grab snacks before heading to my parents' place, and I was reaching for a bag of chips in the produce section when I saw Natalie standing by the apples. We both froze, her hand halfway to a Granny Smith, my arm extended toward the chip display. My shoulders went tight automatically and I felt my jaw clench, but she didn't turn and walk away. She just stood there looking uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. I grabbed my chips and was about to leave when she said my name quietly. We ended up standing there between the produce and the bakery section, having this brief, awkward conversation where she told me she'd been scared of being forgettable her whole life. She said it fast, like she'd been practicing, that she knew she'd manipulated situations to feel important, and she was starting to see how bad that had been. I felt this flash of empathy, recognizing that fear even though I'd never acted on it the way she had, but I kept my physical distance and my emotional walls up. I suggested therapy might help her work through those fears, keeping my voice neutral and polite. She nodded and said she'd actually started seeing someone a few weeks ago, twice a week, and it was helping her understand her patterns. I told her I was glad, and that I hoped it continued helping, but I also made it clear I wasn't interested in rehashing everything that happened between us. She nodded again and said she understood, and we separated without any drama or big emotional scene. At my parents' house, I went through cardboard boxes methodically, pulling out yearbooks and art projects and stuffed animals from elementary school. I kept the things that were mine alone, stuff that represented who I was independent of anyone else, and I left behind every shared memory I didn't want to carry forward. Mom came in a few times to ask if I was sure about leaving certain items, but mostly she respected my choices and didn't push. I packed up 2 small boxes of things I actually wanted, loaded them in the rental car, and felt surprisingly okay about closing this chapter. Sunday morning, I hugged my parents goodbye in their driveway, promised to call more often, and drove straight to the airport. Once I was through security, I sent a message to the family group chat saying I'd landed safely back in Seattle, then put my phone on silent. Theo didn't reach out and I didn't contact him, and the whole trip felt complete and properly boundaried in a way that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Back in my apartment Sunday night, unpacking my small boxes and settling back into my space, I realized my regular routine felt different now. It wasn't just going through motions anymore, but actually building a life that belonged to me. I had my favorite coffee shop where the barista knew my order, my hiking spot with Serena every other Saturday, my therapy appointments with Rena, my work projects that challenged me in good ways. These weren't replacements for what I'd lost with Theo. They were genuine new foundations I was laying down brick by brick. Tuesday evening, Mike sent one more text update mentioning that Theo had been consistently attending his weekly counseling sessions and seemed more stable, less scattered. I thanked him for keeping me informed, but gently asked if he could stop sending updates unless something urgent happened. He replied right away saying he understood and agreed, and I felt relieved to close that information channel. The next morning at work, Gabrielle stopped by my desk with her tablet and asked if I had a few minutes to talk about a project opportunity. We moved to a small conference room where she explained that the product team wanted to build a new analytics dashboard for enterprise clients, and they needed a technical lead who could handle both the architecture and the stakeholder management. I felt that immediate spark of excitement, but instead of just saying yes like I would have 6 months ago, I asked about the timeline and what other commitments I'd need to drop or delay. Gabrielle pulled up the project scope and we went through it together, mapping out what was realistic given my current workload, and what would require pushing back on expectations. She nodded as I outlined my concerns about capacity, and suggested we could bring in a junior developer to handle some of my maintenance work. When I agreed to take it on with those conditions, she smiled and said she was impressed that I knew how to protect my bandwidth, instead of just taking on everything thrown at me. Walking back to my desk, I felt good about the decision. Excited about the challenge, but also proud that I'd negotiated instead of just accepting. Saturday morning, I met Serena at the diner 3 blocks from our building, sliding into our usual booth by the window. The waitress brought coffee without asking, and we ordered our standard breakfasts, while Serena told me about a terrible first date she'd had the night before with a guy who spent 2 hours talking about his cryptocurrency investments. I laughed and shared a story about a failed project demo at work where everything crashed 5 minutes in. We talked about her job search and my new project lead role and whether the building was ever going to fix the broken elevator. None of it connected to my past or required me to explain my history or carry emotional weight from before. Having this friendship that existed entirely in my present, built on who I actually was now instead of who I used to be, felt like proof that I was building something real here. In therapy that week, Rena asked me a question I wasn't expecting. She wanted to know what I actually wanted for my life beyond being loyal to other people, and beyond proving I could handle anything thrown at me. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't have one ready. Everything I'd built had been about being strong enough, capable enough, successful enough to never need anyone. But what did I want just for me, separate from everyone else's needs or expectations? We spent the rest of the session exploring that question without landing on clear answers. Rena suggested I might try journaling about it, writing down what my life would look like if I built it around my own desires, instead of other people's crises. The question itself felt important even though I couldn't answer it yet, like she'd identified something I'd been avoiding without realizing it. In month 5, my phone lit up with a text from Natalie that made my stomach tighten before I even read it. The message was short and said she'd been in therapy for 2 months now and wanted me to know. I stared at it for a few minutes, feeling that old pull to ask questions and offer support and make sure she was okay. Instead, I typed back that I was glad she was getting help and wished her well. I didn't offer to reconnect or ask about her progress or leave any opening for more conversation. She replied with just a simple thanks and didn't push for anything else. I put my phone down feeling okay about the exchange, like I'd been kind without sacrificing the boundaries I needed. That same week, I was putting away laundry when I found Theo's old hoodie stuffed in the back of my closet, the navy blue one I'd borrowed years ago after getting caught in the rain at his restaurant. I pulled it out and held it for a minute, remembering a dozen different times I'd worn it. Then I folded it carefully and found a shipping box in my hall closet. I wrote a brief note saying I thought he might want it back, and dropped it at the post office on my way to work the next morning. The gesture felt like returning something that had never really been mine to keep, closing one more small loop that didn't need to stay open. On a quiet evening a few days later, I sat at my kitchen table with my journal and started writing about what I actually wanted my life to look like. Not what would make me seem strong or successful or like I had it all together, but what would actually make me happy. I wrote about wanting work that challenged me without consuming me, relationships that felt balanced instead of one-sided, being the kind of person who could accept help without feeling weak. The vision I mapped out was realistic and centered on my own values, rather than proving anything to anyone else. Writing it all down made it feel possible instead of just theoretical, like I was giving myself permission to want things that were mine alone. My feature at work launched in early month 5, and within 3 weeks, the adoption numbers exceeded every goal we'd set. Gabrielle forwarded me the company newsletter where my project got highlighted as a model for user-centered design. The recognition felt good, and I accepted the congratulations from my team without deflecting or minimizing what we'd accomplished. But what mattered more than the external validation was that I felt genuinely proud of the work itself, proud of how I'd led the team and made decisions and created something valuable. When Gabrielle mentioned opportunities for advancement and asked if I'd be interested in a senior technical lead role, I realized I was excited about my career for the right reasons now, not just using success to prove I didn't need anyone. In month 6, Theo sent a 1-paragraph email that showed up in my inbox on a Tuesday morning. He wrote that he'd been focusing on sobriety for 4 months now and had taken on more responsibility at the restaurant, managing 2 locations instead of 1. He mentioned he was grateful for my honesty during our coffee meeting and that it had helped him see things more clearly. He said he hoped I was doing well and left it at that. No requests or questions or attempts to pull me back into his world. The message felt warm but complete, like he was updating an old friend without expecting anything in return. I sat with his email for a day before responding, making sure my reply came from a genuine place and not from guilt or obligation. I wrote back that I was glad he was doing better and that his continued growth sounded really positive. I told him I hoped his work on himself brought him real peace. I didn't suggest future contact or leave any doors open for reconciliation or hint that maybe someday we could try again. The exchange felt kind but finished. 2 people who used to be everything to each other now wishing each other well from a distance. The following week, I met Gabrielle at a coffee shop downtown to talk about my career path and what I wanted from the senior lead opportunity. We sat outside despite the typical Seattle drizzle, and she pulled out her tablet to show me different tracks I could take, some more management-focused, and others staying deeply technical. She shared her own story about burning out in her 30s from saying yes to everything, and how she'd learned to choose projects that energized her instead of just drained her. We mapped out a plan that balanced my ambition with actual sustainability, identifying what excited me versus what I was just good at. Walking back to the office afterward, I felt like I'd been given permission to want success without sacrificing myself in the process, to build a career that fit my actual life instead of consuming it. The next weekend, Serena knocked on my door with her toolbox and a determined look. We spent Saturday morning moving my couch away from the wall and angling it toward the window so I could see the water when I sat down. She suggested we hit up a plant shop downtown, and we came back with 3 pothos plants and a snake plant that the shop owner promised could survive my irregular watering schedule. Serena helped me hang the abstract prints I'd bought months ago, but never put up, and we rearranged my bookshelf so my favorite novels faced out, instead of being buried spine first. By afternoon, my apartment looked different in a way that felt intentional rather than accidental. I stood in my living room after Serena left, and realized the space didn't feel like somewhere I was hiding anymore. It felt like a place I actually lived in and chose and made mine. The shift was small, but it mattered. On Tuesday evening, my mom called and we talked for 20 minutes about completely normal things. She told me about my dad's new project restoring an old motorcycle, and asked about my work without pushing for details about my personal life. I asked about their garden, and she described the tomatoes they were growing without mentioning Natalie or Theo or anything from back home. The conversation felt easy in a way it hadn't been in over a year. When we said goodbye, she told me she loved me, and I said it back and meant it. We'd found some new baseline that respected my boundaries without all the tension. The next morning, an email from Natalie appeared in my inbox with the subject line just saying thanks. She wrote 3 short paragraphs about how therapy was helping her understand herself better and recognize patterns she hadn't seen before. She didn't ask to rebuild our relationship or make promises about changing or request anything from me. The message just acknowledged that suggesting therapy had been helpful and that she appreciated it. I read it twice and felt mostly relieved. She was working on herself, and I didn't need to be involved in that process. On Saturday evening in month 6, I walked through my Seattle neighborhood as the sun started setting over the water. The air smelled like salt and coffee, and someone was grilling on their apartment balcony. I thought about Grandpa Lou and how he'd wanted me to be happy. He'd thought that meant marrying Theo, but maybe being happy looked different from he'd imagined. I felt peaceful in a way that didn't require pretending the past year hadn't hurt or erasing everything that happened. I'd survived it and built something new here. The peace wasn't about forgetting or fixing everything. It was about accepting that I'd made it through and created an actual life for myself on the other side.